Hello, welcome to Cyber Threats Exposed. I'm Tim.
Hello, I'm Steve.
And as ever, we are going to talk around all of the happenings and goings on in cyberspace from the previous month. That's January 2025. So anything that we think you guys need to know, we will share throughout this podcast.
This podcast is brought to you in association with Jigsaw Business Networks, a proud WithSecure partner. Founded in 2004, JBN has established an ever-growing list of public and private sector customers across a range of key sectors. JBN manage accounts from start through to successful technology adoption, deployment, and ongoing remote support.
I think this month has been really dominated by identity attacks. Steve, do you want to kind of talk through what the start of the year has brought in that space?
Yes, and I kind of feel like I've been saying this several times, but yeah, identity has been a big topic for attackers and defenders, really. And sort of a brief but important just tidbit that came out is some research showing that, according to some research at least, year on year, there's been a 300% increase in identity-focused attacks, so targeting SaaS and identity services. And we know that use of those kind of services, use of identity, has rapidly increased in the last year. But we are also pretty sure that targeting has as well, and those two together has led to this kind of tripling of those kinds of attacks. And part of the reason for that is because they're so complicated, these kind of platforms and layers of functionality and so on that we're kind of relying on when we try and make things easy, or at least, appear to be easy. You click log in with Google or log in with, with our kind of your enterprise, your corporate security, and suddenly you're in and it's all fine. It's worked wonderfully. And obviously that's great. But it hides a whole lot of complexity in the background. And something that's kind of come out that really highlighted that for me is that researchers found you could hijack kind of defunct, like unregistered, unused anymore domains, recreate email addresses on those domains that were there previously, and just use the kind of linking identity to access any SaaS, any kind of cloud-based accounts that use those email addresses for authentication. Now that kind of shouldn't be possible because it's not just the domain, like the identity is more than just the domain name. It's more than just the email address. And this is a specific flaw in Google OAuth mechanism. And Google OAuth has something called the subclaim functionality, where essentially it identifies the domain with kind of a unique ID, something beyond just example.com. But turns out that Google's implementation of this has a 0.04% inconsistency rate, as it's called, which sounds to me a lot like a failure rate. And because of that 0.04%, it's very small percentage-wise. But when you're doing billions of auths, that's quite a lot of failures.
A lot of organizations, yeah.
Exactly. So downstream providers, people who consume, who provide to their clients, but consume OAuth data from Google, have to just rely on the domain and email address because the subclaim is not reliable enough. And that's where this comes in, that if, the example they used was if a startup company goes bust, you can hop in, grab those domains, recreate some email addresses, and go to any kind of SaaS service they might be using, for leads, for HR, for finance, anything like this, and just go and see what data's still there. Because if they haven't been properly, if they didn't securely delete, remove everything, etc., they could still be there. There could still be data hanging around.
I think in this instance, it was responsibly disclosed from an organization called Truffle Security. The research is brilliant. So there's no impact necessarily directly from this, but it does highlight this huge threat surface around the identity space. There is a lot of actor interest. I mean, the research that Steve, you alluded to at the top around the kind of the tripling of identity attacks by Obsidian is something that we've obviously seen as well with WithSecure. And threat actors are no longer, they are moving from being kind of cloud aware to being cloud astute. Right? They know how to operate within these environments, probably a lot more than the average user. Right? I say probably. I mean, it's almost certain that they understand how these systems work a lot more than the average user, and that puts the blue teams at a distinct disadvantage. Right? So potentially, there's an argument to suggest that you or I could be replaced by robots, because every podcast we seem to be mentioning the same things around identity attacks. We're like those dummies with the pull string at the back, but it's really significant, right? We seldom get an incident now within WithSecure that doesn't involve some kind of identity attack or identity threat.
Yeah,
I mean, it does still happen, of course, but
absolutely. And there's stats. There's all these stats floating around about how many incidents involve previously compromised or known credentials. And this is a big kind of identity thing, because technically knowing someone's credentials they use to, say, log onto the local computer aren't really that helpful, because first you've got to get to that computer. However, as part of this whole, making it look simple while it's all very complicated, cloud, you just access over the internet. You go to the right provider or domain or whatever, and you authenticate, and there you go. And so if you've got some credentials, you can just try them at these various kind of cloud services. So there's some details came out recently, very light on details, but still, about a group who've been named Triple Strength. And they've been observed kind of monetizing compromised clouds through cryptojacking, mining cryptocurrency, through selling access to those clouds to others, selling on the credentials and so on. And they've also been observed active in on-premise networks where they monetize through ransomware, which is kind of the established way to do that. And the interesting thing that people noticed is that the access that they're getting seems to be gained almost entirely through credentials that have been compromised by a specific stealer, raccoon stealer. And so, if you can get the credentials for a cloud environment, you can get in, and either you can get admin, or you've got an administrative credential, or you can elevate through misconfiguration somehow. Then off you go.
Yeah, and raccoon stealer is just one of many that we see, in our logs all the time. I mean, I've made no secret of this. I think the username password model is broken now. I came to this realization when I had to sign up to an account on an app I'd never heard of just to park my car somewhere, and so I looked at all of the username passwords I had saved in my manager. It was borderline ridiculous. But I think another thing that hammers home this point is, if we look at some of the vulnerability exploitation from, advanced nation state actors, compromising VPN and firewalls, the first thing they'll do is exfiltrate a configuration file in an attempt to take usernames, passwords, and credentials, authentication material, and that kind of says it all. Really, I think there is also still a lag in the threat management side, where authenticated vulnerabilities are treated less seriously than non-authenticated vulnerabilities. This is vulnerabilities that you need usernames and passwords to trigger. But frankly, the difference between the two is real small, with the amount of kind of leaked credentials that are out there, and default credentials and guessable credentials. It's not a sound assumption to make anymore.
No. And as much as we would like to think that we're all past the age of, password 1234, we're not. We may be past the age of the most common password is, sex or God, but only just. See, my 80s film references are still totally.
It means nothing to me. It means nothing to me, that, Steve. But back to my parking experience. I mean, I've got a.
You tell us about your parking experience. I want to know.
I was furious, frankly. But I mean, not only do I have to create an account, I've got to create an account on the clock, right? I'm under time pressure now, which is one of the things that you're supposed to look out for in phishing attacks. Right? Is there a kind of an inflated sense of urgency? Well, there is, because I've got to get my kind of parking validated either before a warden comes around or before the grace period runs out. You know, I'm not going to come up with a long, secure, kind of multi-charactered password for this. I've not been back to the same place either. It's not like somewhere I go every day. So I live in fear of every time I park my car to create another account, which adds more threat surface to me as a kind of personal individual. I just think the whole paradigm is broken.
It is,
anyway.
And then there's the talk of QR codes and security and so on. There's been talk of how people have been going around sticking, scam QR codes over the top of the parking scan here to pay for parking stuff.
Yeah. I've never felt less secure in cyberspace than when I'm parking my car. What a world we live in. All right, let's move on. We have to.
Yes,
we have to talk about Deepseek. I think it's impossible to avoid. One of the things I will say is you must have been living under a rock if you haven't heard about Deepseek, but that's because of the huge kind of economic and geopolitical consequences of its release. We're going to kind of talk about the security side of it a little bit more.
Yep.
So what's happened, Steve? Go ahead.
Well, so Deepseek launched, disrupted lots of things, and there's been a number of things that kind of came out. And the first week after they launched, they announced that they believe they're experiencing a DDoS attack, so they were limiting sign-ups. Now, obviously, a DDoS, the only real way to tell the difference between a malicious DDoS attack and just lots of people in lots of places wanting to use your service is looking at the actual kind of traffic coming in and trying to tell if it's valid or not, which only they can do. They've said it's a DDoS. It may or may not have been. But this is an issue, particularly for a heavily loaded service. That yes, you might have protections against the DDoS, but if you are also highly active, and then you get something else that can really push you over the edge. But the researchers at Wiz, as I'm sure a lot of security researchers did, went and had a look-see around the Deepseek domain and online cloud resources and so on, and found a cloud database that had been left completely unsecured. So totally publicly accessible. And that database contained, their things like API secrets, chat histories for people using Deepseek, details of Deepseek's backend data and services that'd be very useful to someone targeting them. And by completely unsecured and exposed, it gave full read and write public access. Meaning that you could start writing things in the database that would be functionally used by Deepseek. So you could get privilege escalation. You could, create, your users and so on. You could perform actual malicious activities just by writing things into this exposed database. Now, unfortunately, this was found by security researchers seemingly before anyone else. They reported it and it was closed up. But considering that it seems this is a company that have spent billions of dollars on developing their product, and yet didn't secure at least one very critical thing, at least one, obviously, then that's quite worrying. And while there's lots of talk around the geopolitical ramifications and, what's the threat of it and what's their privacy policy say and where's your data going, the fact that is it just very shoddily made?
I mean, I think this is really interesting to me. So if you're listening to this podcast, you might be thinking, what do I do with this information now if you're considering Deepseek? Because, frankly, Deepseek aren't the only ones ever to leave a cloud storage bucket totally exposed with incorrect privileges, right? This happens all the time. I mean, you cannot, discount suppliers as a result of this because it happens. So this is a really interesting topic for us. because it's the talk of the town, right? It's been the kind of the cause behind the single biggest market capitalization fall of a company in history.
Although, I mean, 5 of the top 10 largest falls in history are also NVIDIA.
Yeah, it's pretty volatile. So in order to answer the question, kind of what do we do about this and that, maybe how can we understand a little bit more, as you kind of mentioned, there's been a lot of kind of hostile kind of news and briefing against Deepseek. Now, I'm not saying that isn't justified. I'm not saying they're being unfairly treated at all. But what I am saying is that sometimes it's hard to kind of extrapolate actionable kind of insight from that. Steve and I have released a separate podcast with one of the experts within WithSecure on large language models and testing their security and what organizations can do. So go and check that out. Or if it hasn't been released yet and we're not in control of the release schedule, so just a peek behind the curtain for the listener there. If it hasn't been released yet, then look out for its release and then listen to it there. So really in that we drill into the kind of security implications of large language models, not just Deepseek, but what an organization should be thinking about as opposed to getting swept up in kind of media sensationalism.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean, yeah, a lot of the more sensationalist kind of things about Deepseek, I would say, are more of an artifact of where you stand and what your view is, as opposed to inherent things that are specific to Deepseek.
And by where you stand, I think you mean physically on what country on the planet.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not necessarily just a moral stance. Okay.
No.
I mentioned us being kind of dolls where you could pull a string and we come up with the same identity.
Mass exploitation.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we've got one setting, we've got two, and the other one is mass exploitation. Do you want to talk about that? So it's been a tough January, frankly.
Well, I mean, it was, and this one is quite brief, at least the nugget of news that we have to dispense here, and that is that some researchers performed a hardware and software assessment of Palo Alto's firewalls, and what they said they found was that the devices used commodity hardware, so nothing particularly special to lock down, just pull off the shelves. The software the devices ran had known vulnerabilities in, so they were running known vulnerable software. The firmware had known vulnerable, software inside it, and there were certain expected foundational security features that were not included. And now adding this up, this meant that Eclipse found flaws that would allow seemingly a remote attacker with administrative access to bypass secure boot. And as we said before, while you might go, administrative access, that's a high bar. Well, it's not been very high bar recently, has it? So a remote attacker with admin access, if you can bypass secure boot, you can install an undetectable rootkit and permanently, essentially, compromise the device. So that's all pretty not great. And it's also kind of what we sort of come to expect from network appliances, because we obviously see them as being these security devices for securing the perimeters of our networks. But actually, they are maybe providing security, but they may not necessarily be secure themselves. And this is not a dig at Palo Alto. This is more a case of this is kind of what we'd expect from someone looking at these devices, because they haven't been looked at in this way, it seems, before, and people are now starting to. And thus we're having this whole rash of discoveries being made. And, I don't want to spoiler February too much, but we've already had at least half an hour this morning going, is this a new vulnerability, or is it an old one, or is it from last year? It's just been a bit more.
The months do blur into one, and as obviously there's no kind of strict time barriers on this. We might learn about a vulnerability being exploited in January that was exploited first exploited back in November or even earlier. But in January, we have seen vulnerabilities or details of vulnerabilities being exploited emerge and it's not just Palo Alto, as you mentioned. We've seen Avanti, we've seen Fortinet, we've seen Sonic Wall. So that's a large chunk of enterprise firewalls in the market.
Yes.
That have been under active compromise from a wide set of actors, ransomware, state-sponsored, etc. So it's the drum that we're going to have to keep beating, I think. Understand your exposure from the outside, and understand that these devices are a vector in themselves, not just a mitigative technology.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
They are conduits, and they may unfortunately go in both directions. Moving on to something else that we talk about quite a lot.
Some more good news. Ransomware. Is it good news? Give me some good news, Steve.
Depends if you're a ransomware operator, I guess.
Right. Okay. That doesn't sound good.
No.
Actually, no. I'm gonna come in with some good news, and I don't know whether this is has come into February or not. I think it may have, but I'm going to mention it anyway because I feel like I've been too gloomy. But researchers have actually published findings on ransomware payment. So looking at the actual cryptocurrency that's being transacted to malicious actors, and that has appeared to reduce, which means less kind of payments to actors, which also may mean more victims being added to the leak site. So I wanted to get that in ahead of time because we're going to talk about victims on leak sites, but there is some evidence that suggests the reason that the numbers may have increased, spoiler alert, apologies, is because of less money going to the attackers, which is broadly a good thing if the companies have recovered well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that is the thing, because we are talking about numbers. So we kind of assume on a month-to-month basis that there's not a huge difference in the activity that's happening. But over longer time periods, there may actually be quite a large difference in what's going on. So this month, Klopp posted 60 more victims than last month. So 63 instead of 3. Lynx posted 27 more than last month, so 42. And Ink ransomware went up from 8 last month to 28 this month. So those top 3, it's more than 100 victims increase.
But we know why Klopp are hitting the top, right?
I can't remember. What was it again?
Well, they had the mass exploitation campaign around Clio, wasn't it? So
yes. So yeah, more. Well, but then was it? Oh God, this is where I'm like, what month is it? Clio, obviously, and I'm like, that was like October, right? That was a long time ago. No,
the victims are just hitting now. From the start.
So
I think there's probably more to come as well, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, yes. Interestingly, so Klopp come out on top this month. Second place was Ransom Hub with 43 victims. And they actually dropped by 13 this month. So they're actually one of the drops. So they're still second because they've had that many. So you add it all up, and there's just over 500 victims were posted this January calendar month. Now that would make it the 4th busiest month in 2024, if it was in 2024, which is bad considering January is typically the quietest month. However, as you said, we've got this kind of spike from Klopp, who've been saving things up and dropping them out again. And there is also seemingly a change from the kind of big game hunting going to those really big numbers to more operators, more brands going after larger numbers of smaller groups. So this could be speculation here, but it could be a response to the law enforcement activity, which has gone after, obviously, those groups who've stuck their heads way over the parapet. And it could also be a case of that they've got lots and lots of possible victims. So if they can essentially, pick out the easy ones, get a quick win on each of them, and then bugger off again, then that might be a better use of the resources of most of these groups. We know that there are big game hunters out there who are still trying for the largest ones, and they are going to be, I would assume, I would predict, a rarity. Whereas groups looking to automate, to go after lots of them, mass exploit, get in, take whatever, do whatever you can, may lead to this appearance of, okay, we've got about almost 4 times as many victims this January as we did in January 2023. But what's the value of those victims? What's the impact of the attacks? That we cannot say from this data.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point because we've been tracking the kind of compression of large and extra large organizations and the expansion of kind of small to medium sized organizations being impacted by ransomware. You can't really compare. While we probably can compare kind of June to July with a level of equivalence, it's a lot different from a small to a large organization, just in terms of resources, ability to respond on their own, ability to pay ransoms, for example. So it does become quite tricky, and we do enter a slightly more kind of uncertainty, but it does appear that is the case. I think you make a really interesting point around also looking to kind of, there has been a lot of counter ransomware activity from competent authorities, international law enforcement, for example. And there does seem to be another effort to evade the gaze of these authorities. I mean, traditionally, organizations or ransomware affiliates would not target hospitals, for example, in order to achieve this. Now that's gone out the window. I think what they largely do is seek to kind of switch up and have a kind of higher level of flux amongst ransomware variants or franchises. So we have seen a case as well from January where an actor that we kind of track, and it's tracked in the industry as Storm 1811, which is obviously an industry designation for an intrusion set, but that traditionally uses a ransomware variant called Blackbuster. But there has been some details emerging from our kind of industrial colleagues around Storm 1811 now deploying Cactus ransomware. So all intents and purposes, the intrusion is pretty much the same until the very final malware payload gets dropped, which is the thing that does all the encryption. So it's likely that we will see kind of a higher level of flux between final payloads dropped from the same actors as they attempt to minimize their perceived impact on society. And it's our job as threat intelligence professionals to see through that.
Yep. Yeah. To track the tricksy ransomware people.
The tricksy ransomware people. I don't like that. It minimizes. Remember, these people target.
Exactly. I was going to say I don't want to minimize it through just there. But I also don't want to, big these people up as some kind of big bads or whatever when the activities they're taking are very malicious. But I don't particularly want to give them any credit.
Yes. Okay. Agreed. Let's talk about AI and ransomware. I think there was an interesting, pseudo interesting. I think it's kind of benefit us shedding some light onto this because it's one of those kind of sensationalist stories, and it does tick all the boxes for propagation through the tech media.
Shall I?
Yeah, you go. You explain.
All right. So there's a report about a group called FunkSec. And they were described as alleged top ransomware group who use AI-assisted ransomware, which obviously great title there. Now, I'm pretty sure that the alleged was sort of an in-joke. The alleged top, because there's nothing actually in the report that says why they're described as a top group. I think it's because they themselves have said this, but since that's not been clarified, I don't know. And by the use of AI-assisted ransomware, alarm bells may be ringing for people going, oh God, oh no. But actually, what it means is that it appears that they've just used like Copilot, ChatGPT generated code in their malware and their encryption locker. Now, how do we know this? Because obviously code generated by an AI or by LLM is essentially the same as code generated by anybody else, apart from often not quite as good. Well, they appear to be Algerian. There's a couple of links to Algeria, both in the kind of names and so on, and references they've used, and in some geographical ties. And their level of English is quite low. They're not very good at communicating in English. However, certain parts of their locker and malware code has perfect English comments for every single segment of code saying what it is and how it's doing what it's doing. Essentially exactly what the LLM generated code does. And this really illustrates how LLMs can lower that barrier for entry for low-skilled groups. That's right, I have called them a low-skilled group because that's what they appear to be.
I think when we're kind of, we're in the industry, we are really keen to look out for kind of the impact of AI in cybercrime. However, when we are identifying code based on comments that look like potentially they are comments that come from ChatGPT generated code, I do think maybe we are kind of overstating the impact that it is currently having on the ecosystem. Now, of course, this is not to minimize the impact that AI and large language models will have as they kind of penetrate further. However, we are still at relatively low stakes, I think, on the AI cyber game if we are identifying their capabilities based on comments, not based on actually how the ransomware is working. Is it particularly stealthy? Is it employing advanced techniques? No. Is it particularly stealthy? No. But it has got certain comments in it, which means.
But then, isn't that then on itself a commentary on AI? Like it's. So I don't particularly like the term AI, and LLM or Gen AI is better because we're saying it's emulating what people would do. And I loved some of the studies that showed how the quality of code written by AI generation differs depending on the language, because it's based upon the quality of the examples on the internet. So stuff, I think, I can't remember exactly what it was, but thus the rarer the language, so COBOL and things like this, and even assembly, apparently it was better at than the more common languages, because with the more common languages, there's more crap on the internet.
There's more people butchering it in Stack Overflow.
Yeah, I think exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing I don't want to do is minimize the impact this is going to have. I think we need to kind of separate the impact it's currently having versus what it might do, because, quite frankly, AI does have a great potential to aid and assist development for low-skilled actors. And I am including myself in that. I am a very low-skilled actor when it comes to writing code. So, but I just don't do it for nefarious means.
Exactly. Yeah. So that it does matter. It's fine. It's
great. Is there any more AI stories, Steve, we can cover?
So only one of interest, I would say. Only one I would pick out, which is that Meta's Llama has been announced to have had a vulnerability that was patched in October. And it was a data deserialization remote code execution vulnerability. Essentially, you put some data in, and instead of it just getting written from one place to another, when it's written through a piece of code, it's actually executed instead of, just passed around. So that means if you put an executable command in there, it will run it. And it's actually a vulnerability or a problem with like an underlying library that Llama uses, like a Python library. And so this highlights for me that thing about the fact that an LLM is the top of a complex stack of software. And there may be these kind of, we've talked a lot about, prompt injection and jailbreak attacks and things like this, but actually there's a whole bunch of existing hardware, software supply chain vulnerabilities around LLMs that are just as, if not more concerning than these specific, main things, than the specific sort of inherent problems of LLMs.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well put. And again, another plug. You can listen now to our podcast on LLMs, or you can listen soon to our podcast on LLMs, depending on release time.
You can, will, may listen to, have listened to.
I'm just trying to give the producers enough time to edit me appropriately for for the release, depending on the release schedule. Okay, great. I guess let's just kind of top this all up with some kind of tactical kind of news stories, the things we've been seeing. And WithSecure, I think the click fix campaigns have been really rife at the moment. This is where it's a kind of form of social engineering, right? You are directed to a site. Typically at the moment, it's presenting fake capture pages where you prove you're a human, not a robot. And it's giving the uninitiated to kind of Windows shortcuts, instructions on how to launch a terminal. It adds some code into your clipboard, and the unsuspecting user will then hit Control V to paste and enter to run this code, and that's how the malware is delivered. Now, this is shockingly rudimental in terms of how it's done. You are just instructing somebody to shoot themselves in the head, but it's also shockingly effective. It's working an awful lot. We saw it loads at the back end of last year with a malware called Llama Stealer. It seems that a lot of other info stealers are now deploying the same tactics and techniques. Again, as a result of its success.
Yes, it's becoming less and less a specific kind of a specific group's thing, and it's proven to be successful where everyone's doing it.
Yeah, and again, it's just as advanced as endpoint protection software and EDR software becomes, there is always a vector with the human. I think another thing to look out for: software supply chains. Not a week goes by without us seeing 1, 2, or 3 stories on these where organizations are importing libraries into their kind of code development processes, and they're importing libraries that they haven't checked, they can't verify. It's a bit of a wild west, and actors have realized this. So that kind of the code dependency protection is super important, and organizations need to know what code they're running, because it's not too dissimilar from just downloading an executable from the internet and double clicking on it. Really, it is ultimately running code.
There's and there have been stories this month of places getting compromised due to someone trying to download a software crack and running it, and it's malware. And as that may seem completely noddy, and oh gosh, everyone should know not to do that. Then at the same time, there's stories of places getting compromised through software supply chain, where someone's just downloaded some code from somewhere, and they didn't correctly verify that they got the URL or the name right or whatever, and they've just run some code they downloaded.
Yeah, human nature hasn't changed. I mean, we've had cases again this month where people have just tried to download cracked software, not just on Windows but on Macs. We're seeing a lot of search engine manipulations, I guess, malicious ads that kind of point to fake versions of legitimate software that people are trying to access. There's no real reason to believe that they are not the legitimate article, and they're being downloaded and run. So these kind of social engineering techniques are back with a vengeance, really. And that hasn't even mentioned the wave of Microsoft Teams phishing, bombarding attempts to perform the age-old IT support scam leading to ransomware. So maybe the theme of this podcast for the tactical side is social engineering.
Absolutely.
Okay. Is there anything else, Steve, you wanted to cover from January, or have we put the cyber world to rights?
I think we've kind of covered it, to be honest. Some crypto got stolen. Some apparently secure things turned out not to be secure. There was yet another record DDoS attack, but these things happen.
Okay. All right. In that case, we will end it there. Thanks very much for listening, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Cheers.
This podcast was brought to you by Jigsaw Business Networks. For more information, visit jigsawbn.com